The day my mother passed away, the sky was an overcast gray, as if the world knew the sorrow that was about to unfold. I sat beside her bed in the dimly lit room, holding her frail hand, which was once strong and capable, the hand that had nurtured me through every stage of my life. The quiet hum of the oxygen machine filled the room, a constant reminder of how fragile her existence had become. My mother, Anne, was a woman of simple means but immense strength. She had raised me on her own after my father left us, when I was just a child. Despite the hardships, she always found a way to provide for us, making every dollar stretch, working long hours at the local grocery store. Her sacrifices were countless, her love immeasurable. She was my rock, my guiding light in a world that often felt too harsh and unforgiving. When she was diagnosed with cancer 2 years ago, it felt as though the ground beneath me had shifted, leaving me unsteady and fearful of the future. I watched as the disease slowly consumed her, stealing away her vitality, her independence, and eventually her will to fight. The medical bills piled up, and though my husband Richard had initially supported the decision to care for her at home, his patience had worn thin as time passed. Richard and I had been married for 5 years. He was a man of ambition, always focused on his career as a corporate lawyer, where success was measured by the number of hours he billed in the cases he won. He was handsome, with his neatly combed hair and tailored suits, always the picture of perfection. But beneath the surface, there was a hardness in him, a pragmatism that often bordered on coldness. As I sat by my mother's bedside, her breathing shallow and labored, Richard stood in the doorway, his arms crossed over his chest. The tension between us had been building for months, and I could feel it simmering just beneath the surface, waiting to erupt. He had grown distant, resentful even, of the time and energy I devoted to caring for my mother. "Claire, we need to talk," Richard said, his voice low and controlled, but there was an edge to it that made my stomach tighten. I turned to look at him, my eyes red and puffy from the constant stream of tears I had shed. "Not now, Richard," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Please, not now." He took a step into the room, his expression hardening. "Yes, now. This has gone on long enough. She's been a burden on us, on you for too long. It's time we face reality. She's poor, she's sick, and she's—" "Stop it," I interrupted, my voice trembling with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "How can you say that? She's my mother, Richard. She's not just some burden to be discarded." He let out a sigh of frustration, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "Claire, I'm just being realistic. We've spent a fortune on her care, and it's draining us financially. We have to think about our future. She's not going to get better, and prolonging this is only making it harder for everyone." I felt a surge of anger rise within me, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't about money or convenience or our future. This is about her final moments, about being there for her when she needs us the most. She gave everything for me, and I won't abandon her now, no matter how difficult it is." Richard's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. "She's been nothing but a drain on our lives, Claire. You're so consumed by guilt and sentimentality that you can't see it. She's poor and useless now, and keeping her here is just prolonging the inevitable." The words hung in the air like a poisonous cloud, suffocating the space between us. I felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under me, the shock of his callousness knocking the wind out of me. I had always known Richard was pragmatic, but this was something else entirely. This was cruelty, plain and simple. "Get out," I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of rage and despair. "Get out of this room. Now." Richard looked taken aback, as though he hadn't expected me to stand up to him. But there was no mistaking the fury in my eyes. He turned on his heel and left the room without another word, the door closing behind him with a finality that echoed in my ears. I turned back to my mother, who had been quietly listening to our exchange. Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked at me with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "Claire, my sweet girl," she whispered, her voice weak but filled with love. "Don't waste your energy on anger. There's no time for that now." Tears welled up in my eyes as I knelt beside her, taking her hand in mine. "I'm so sorry, Mama," I sobbed. "I'm so sorry you had to hear that." She gave me a gentle smile, her fingers brushing against my cheek. "Don't be sorry, my love. I've lived a long life, and I've known great love. Your love. That's what matters, not the words of someone who doesn't understand." I could feel the tears streaming down my face, hot and relentless, as I clung to her hand. "I don't know how to do this without you," I whispered, my voice breaking. "You will," she said softly. "You're stronger than you know, Claire, and you have a good heart. Don't let anyone take that away from you." I nodded, unable to speak, as I felt the weight of her words settle into my heart. My mother had always been my source of strength, and now, as she lay dying, she was still teaching me how to live. We sat in silence for a while, the only sound the steady beep of the heart monitor and the rhythmic hiss of the oxygen machine. I could feel her slipping away, the life that had once burned so brightly within her, now reduced to a fragile flicker. "Promise me one thing," she said after a while, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Anything, Mama," I replied, leaning closer so I could hear her. "Promise me you'll live your life with love, with kindness. Don't let bitterness or anger consume you. You deserve to be happy, Claire. You deserve to be loved." "I promise," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I promise." She smiled, a faint, contented smile, and closed her eyes. Her breathing slowed, each inhale more shallow than the last, until finally she took one last breath and was gone. The room fell into an eerie silence, the world outside seeming to hold its breath, as if acknowledging the loss of a remarkable woman. I sat there, frozen in place, unable to process what had just happened. The woman who had been my entire world was gone, leaving me adrift in a sea of grief and uncertainty. I felt a hand on my shoulder, and I looked up to see Richard standing there, his expression unreadable. "We need to start making arrangements," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth or empathy. "There's a lot to do." Something inside me broke at that moment. It wasn't just the loss of my mother, but the realization that I was truly alone, even in my own marriage. Richard, the man I had once loved, had become a stranger, a man who couldn't even muster the decency to show compassion in the face of death. "Leave," I said, my voice hollow. "Just leave me alone." "Claire," I said, "leave," I shouted, the force of my words surprising even myself. Richard stared at me for a moment, his eyes cold and unyielding, before he turned and walked out of the room, leaving me alone with my grief. For a long time, I sat by my mother's side, unable to move, unable to think. I felt like a part of me had died with her, leaving behind a gaping void that nothing could ever fill. But as I sat there, I began to remember her final words, the promise I had made to her. She had asked me to live my life with love and kindness, to not let bitterness or anger consume me. But how could I do that when the man I was married to had shown me nothing but coldness and cruelty? How could I honor her memory while remaining in a marriage that was as empty as the room I now found myself in? The days that followed were a blur of funeral arrangements, condolences from friends and family, and the overwhelming sense of loss that clung to me like a shroud. Richard was present but distant, going through the motions without any real emotion. It was as if he had already moved on, as if my mother's death was just another inconvenience he had to deal with before getting back to his real life. The final straw came a week after the funeral. I was sitting in the living room, going through some of my mother's old photographs, trying to hold on to the memories of her that were slipping away too quickly. Richard walked in, his briefcase in hand, ready to leave for work. "I've been thinking," he said, his tone matter of fact. "Now that your mother's gone, We should consider selling the house. It's too big for just the two of us, and we could use the money to invest in something smaller, more practical." I looked up at him, my heart sinking. This was her home, Richard. The place where she raised me, where she spent her final days. I can't just sell it. "It's just a house, Claire," he replied, his voice impatient. "We need to think about the future, about what makes sense for us. Holding on to this place is just sentimental nonsense." I felt a wave of anger and sadness wash over me. How had we come to this? How had the man I married become so cold, so detached from the things that mattered most to me? "I'm not selling the house," I said firmly. "And if you can't understand that, then maybe we need to reconsider what we're doing here." He stared at me, his eyes narrowing. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I can't do this anymore," I replied, my voice trembling but resolute. "I can't stay in a marriage where there's no love, no compassion. My mother's death has shown me that life is too short to waste on someone who doesn't care." Richard's face hardened, and for a moment I saw a flicker of anger in his eyes. "So you're just going to throw it all away? Because of some sentimental attachment to a house?" "No," I said quietly. "I'm throwing it away because I've realized that I deserve better. I deserve someone who respects me, who values the things that matter to me. And that's not you, Richard." He stood there, stunned into silence, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. But I knew in my heart that this was the right decision, the only decision I could make if I wanted to honor my mother's memory and the promise I had made to her. "I'll be staying here," I said, my voice steady. "You can go if you want, but I'm not leaving." Richard looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out the door, leaving me alone in the house that had once been our home. As I stood there, the sound of the door closing behind him echoing in my ears, I felt a sense of relief, of clarity. I had lost my mother, but in doing so, I had found myself. I had found the strength to stand up for what I believed in, to demand the respect and love that I deserved. The days that followed were difficult, but they were also filled with a new sense of purpose. I threw myself into restoring the house, preserving the memories of my mother that were etched into every corner. I planted a garden in the backyard, filled with her favorite flowers, a living tribute to the woman who had given me everything. As time passed, the pain of her loss began to fade, replaced by a deep, abiding love for the life she had lived and the lessons she had taught me. I surrounded myself with people who cared, who understood the value of compassion and kindness, and slowly, I began to heal. One day, as I was sitting in the garden, watching the sunset behind the trees, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known in a long time. My mother's words came back to me, the promise I had made to her echoing in my heart. I had chosen love. I had chosen kindness. And in doing so, I had found the strength to move on, to create a life that was full of meaning, full of the things that truly mattered. Richard had been right about one thing. Life was about moving on. But it wasn't about leaving behind the things that mattered. It was about holding on to them, cherishing them, and using them to build a future that was rich in love, in kindness, in the things that made life worth living. And as I sat there, in the garden that was now in full bloom, I knew that I had kept my promise. I had honored my mother's memory, and in doing so, I had found my own strength, my own voice, and that was something no one could ever take away from me. In the deeply emotional narrative titled, "My husband dismissed my mother as poor and useless during her final hours," Claire faces the heart-wrenching loss of her beloved mother, Anne, who had been her pillar of strength throughout her life. Anne, a hard-working and selfless woman, is slowly succumbing to cancer, leaving Claire to grapple with the inevitable end. However, as Anne's life ebbs away, Claire's husband, Richard, reveals a chilling indifference toward her mother's suffering. Richard, a successful but cold corporate lawyer, sees Anne's illness as a burden, dismissing her as poor and useless during her final moments. As Claire struggles to reconcile her love for her mother with her husband's callousness, she finds herself at a crossroads. The story delves into the profound impact of loss, the complexities of marriage, and the realization that not all relationships are built to withstand the storms of life. Through Claire's journey of grief, the story explores themes of love, kindness, self-respect, and the courage it takes to stand up for what truly matters. In the wake of her mother's death, Claire is faced with a pivotal decision: whether to remain in a loveless marriage or to honor her mother's legacy by choosing a life filled with love and compassion. Ultimately, Claire discovers that sometimes moving on means letting go of the people who no longer support the person you've become. As she rebuilds her life, she finds strength in her mother's memory and the promise she made to live with love and kindness, forging a path toward a future where she can finally find peace and happiness.